The Invisible Pillar. I didn't plan on watching a multi-million-dollar company implode from my couch while sipping Cabernet, but when the CEO's son calls your decade of work garbage code and shows you the door. Sometimes the universe delivers justice in spectacular fashion. Let me back up. I'm Camille Dawson, and until 6 weeks ago, I was the lead integration engineer at NetGlide Systems. If you've never heard of us, that's by design. We're the invisible backbone behind thousands of companies' billing systems. Our software processes transactions worth billions every month across 43 countries and 17 currencies. The kind of critical infrastructure nobody notices until it stops working. I joined NetGlide 11 years ago when it was just 17 people crammed into a converted warehouse in Havenport's tech district. Back then, we were scrappy, ambitious, and terrified of failure. I built much of our core currency normalization system, the complex machinery that ensures when a customer in Tokyo pays in yen and another in London pays in pounds, both transactions are properly processed, recorded, and reconciled across multiple banking systems and regulatory frameworks. It's not sexy work. Nobody wins innovation awards for making sure decimal points land in the right place, but it's essential. One misplaced zero can mean the difference between profit and bankruptcy. For a decade, I maintained and expanded that system, adding layers of complexity as we grew. Yes, parts of the codebase were old. Some sections even looked messy to outside eyes. But there's a difference between messy and broken. My system never broke. 10 years. 0 critical failures. In our industry, that's practically a miracle. Then Preston Langford happened. Preston was 26. Fresh out of an MBA program his father had donated a building to, and apparently in desperate need of something to do. So our CEO, Harrison Langford, created a position for him, Executive Vice President of Technical Operations, a fancy title that essentially meant he had authority over every technical department without having written a single line of production code in his life. Our first interaction should have been a warning sign. He called an all-hands meeting his second day. "I've been reviewing our system's architecture," he announced to a room full of engineers who'd built those systems. "And frankly, I'm concerned about what I'm seeing. Technical debt everywhere, outdated frameworks, spaghetti code. We need to modernize." The room was silent. Not the respectful silence of agreement, but the stunned silence of people wondering if they were in some kind of bizarre corporate prank show. "I've prepared a 90-day transformation roadmap," he continued, clicking to a slide with timelines so aggressive they could only have been created by someone who had never actually built software. "We're going to refactor everything, clean architecture principles, full test coverage, CI/CD pipeline overhauls." It all sounded reasonable enough in theory, but any experienced engineer knows you don't just refactor everything in a complex production system that handles billions of dollars, especially not in 90 days. After the meeting, I approached him with what I thought was a reasonable concern. "I like your enthusiasm," I said, "but I want to make sure you understand how our currency normalization system works. It's handling about 40 million transactions daily, and it has some necessary complexity due to international banking regulations." He cut me off with a wave of his hand. "I've looked at that code. It's a perfect example of what we need to fix. No documentation, no clear architecture, just a bunch of workarounds piled on top of each other." "There is documentation," I said, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. "I've maintained detailed schematics of—" "Look, Camille, right?" He checked my badge. "I appreciate your commitment to the legacy systems, but we're moving forward. We'll be implementing modern microservices architecture with proper separation of concerns." I tried once more. "The normalization engine has to handle 17 different currency formats with varying decimal precision requirements. Each country has different—" "That's exactly the problem," he interrupted again. "Too much complexity in one system. We'll break it into microservices, each handling one specific function, clean, modular, scalable." He wasn't entirely wrong in theory, but theory and practice are distant relatives that often don't speak to each other. I nodded and walked away. I'd been at NetGlide long enough to recognize when to pick my battles. This wasn't a battle. It was an incoming natural disaster. Sometimes the only reasonable response is to get out of the way. Over the next 2 weeks, Preston assembled what he called his transformation team, mostly recent graduates with impressive degrees but minimal experience. They created Slack channels I wasn't invited to and set up Jira boards I couldn't access. Then came the code review that sealed my fate. Preston scheduled it for 8 a.m. on a Monday, which already felt like a power move. I presented the currency normalization system, explaining the core functions and why certain decisions had been made over the years. This section here, I said, pointing to a particularly complex function, handles disparities between banking systems that process decimals differently. Japanese yen doesn't use decimal places, while euro transactions need to account for different comma and period usage across European countries. Preston leaned forward, frowning at the screen. "What is this?" He pointed to a block of code with multiple nested conditions. "That's the normalization bridge," I explained. "It ensures that when transactions cross between different currency systems, the values are correctly interpreted regardless of origin or destination format." "This is terrible," he said flatly. "Look at all these nested if statements. This is exactly the kind of spaghetti code we need to eliminate. It looks complex, but each condition is handling a specific edge case that no modern codebase should look like this," he interrupted. "This is the kind of bad code that creates maintenance nightmares." The room went silent. Several engineers who had worked with me for years suddenly became intensely interested in their laptops. "This system has run without a critical incident for 10 years, I said quietly. "It processes 40 million transactions daily across 17 currencies. And it's a miracle it hasn't collapsed," Preston replied. "We're going to refactor this immediately. Clean, testable code with proper separation of concerns." I took a deep breath. I would strongly advise against replacing this system without thoroughly understanding why each of these conditions exists. Some of them handle very specific regulatory requirements or banking system idiosyncrasies that aren't documented anywhere else. Preston smiled the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Camille, but we need to move forward with modern best practices. My team will handle the refactoring." I looked around the room, hoping someone else would speak up. No one did. 10 years of perfect reliability apparently counted for nothing against the CEO's son with his MBA and buzzwords. Over the next week, I was systematically excluded from every relevant discussion. My access to certain repositories was revoked for security during the transition. I wasn't invited to planning meetings. Messages in Slack went unanswered. The message was clear I was being phased out. I could have fought harder. I could have gone over Preston's head to his father or other executives. But I'd been at NetGlide long enough to know how office politics worked. The CEO's son doesn't get sidelined because some engineer thinks he's making a mistake, even if that mistake might cost the company millions. So I made a decision. If they were determined to learn this lesson the hard way, I wouldn't stand in their way, but I also wouldn't leave myself vulnerable. I spent a weekend backing up everything, not company property or confidential data. I'm not a thief. But my own documentation, the personal notes I'd kept over years explaining why certain solutions had been implemented the way they were, the institutional knowledge that existed only in my head, I organized it all, labeled it clearly, and stored it securely offline. Then I removed all my personal notes from the company systems. Not the code itself, I would never sabotage that, just the explanations, the context, the warnings about what might happen if certain functions were altered without understanding their purpose. The following Monday, I was called into HR. "We're restructuring the engineering department," the HR manager said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Your position has been eliminated." I nodded. I'd been expecting this. "The severance package is generous," she continued, sliding a folder across the table. 6 months' salary, extended benefits, and we won't contest unemployment if you need it." I glanced through the documents. The severance was indeed substantial enough to buy my silence. They clearly hoped. "There's a non-disparagement clause," she pointed out. "Standard procedure." "Of course," I said, signing where indicated. I had no intention of disparaging NetGlide publicly. I didn't need to. Reality would do that for me soon enough. I was escorted to my desk to collect my personal items, supervised by security, as though I might try to steal something or sabotage the systems. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 11 years of protecting these systems, I was now considered a threat. As I packed my coffee mug and family photos, Preston appeared, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Camille, I want you to know this isn't personal," he said. "We're just moving in a different direction, embracing modern methodologies." I looked at him. This young man so confident in his limited knowledge, so secure in his position not because of merit but because of his last name. "I understand completely," I said. "Sometimes systems need to evolve." He seemed relieved by my acceptance. "Exactly. The refactoring is already underway. We're implementing a much cleaner architecture." "I wish you all the best with it," I said, closing my box of belongings. "Just one piece of advice, if I may." He hesitated, then nodded magnanimously. "Ask questions," I said simply. "When you don't understand why something was built a certain way, ask someone who might know before changing it." His expression hardened slightly. "We have excellent engineers who understand modern best practices, but I appreciate the input." I nodded and walked out of NetGlide for the last time, carrying 11 years of experience in a small cardboard box. The first week of unemployment was strange. I slept late, took long walks, caught up on reading. I received a few messages from former colleagues expressing sympathy or indignation on my behalf, but most stayed silent, protecting their own positions. I didn't blame them. In tech, you learn to keep your head down when the storm comes. There would always be another job for me. I updated my LinkedIn profile and within days had recruiters reaching out with opportunities. But I didn't respond immediately. Something told me to wait, to watch. It took exactly 18 days for the first signs of trouble to appear. I was browsing Reddit when I noticed a post in RR Software Gore NetGlide just charged me 0.01 NOS for my $899 subscription. The post included a screenshot of an invoice showing a $899 subscription with a final charge of $0.01. In the comments, dozens of others reported similar issues. Some were being charged pennies for $1,000 services. Others were seeing massive overcharges, $10,000 for services that should cost $100. I smiled into my coffee cup. The currency normalization bridge was failing exactly as I had expected it would. You see, that spaghetti code Preston had been so eager to replace contained a critical function. It reconciled how different systems handled decimal places. When a Japanese transaction in yen, which doesn't use decimals, interfaced with a European system that placed decimals differently than American systems, my code ensured everything was normalized correctly. Without it, the system would default to the most literal interpretation of the numbers. A transaction of 1,000 yen, about $100, might be processed as $10,000, or 0.01, depending on where the decimal was incorrectly placed. Over the next few days, the chaos spread. Customers were flooding support channels. Twitter was ablaze with complaints. Several larger clients publicly announced they were suspending their use of NetGlide services until the billing issues were resolved. I didn't need to do anything. I hadn't sabotaged the system. I hadn't planted a time bomb. I had simply allowed Preston to remove the bad code that was actually saving the company from itself. A week into the crisis, NetGlide's stock had dropped 43%. Financial news sites were running stories with headlines like, "Billing disaster costs NetGlide millions in market cap." The company issued a statement about temporary technical issues that were being addressed by our engineering team. I wondered how that team was faring. Those bright young graduates with their modern methodologies, now faced with fixing a system they had dismantled without understanding. Were they working around the clock, desperately trying to figure out why transactions were being processed with wildly incorrect amounts? Were they drowning in customer complaints and executive pressure? I felt a twinge of sympathy for them. They weren't to blame. They were just following orders, implementing clean architecture as directed by someone who had never written production code. On day 12 of the crisis, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Camille Dawson," I answered. "Camille, this is Richard Mercer. I recognized the name immediately. Richard was NetGlide's CFO, a serious, numbers-focused executive I'd always respected. "Hello, Richard," I said neutrally. "What can I do for you?" He sighed heavily. "I think you know why I'm calling. We're in a situation here." "I've heard there are some issues with the billing system," I said mildly. "Issues," he repeated with a bitter laugh. "That's one way to put it. We've lost 3 major clients already. Our stock is in freefall. The engineering team can't figure out what's wrong with the currency processing." I remained silent, waiting. "Look," he continued after a moment, "mistakes were made. The decision to replace your system without proper transition planning was ill-advised." That was as close to an admission of fault as I was likely to get from a C-level executive. "What exactly are you asking?" "Richard, we need you to come back and help us fix this. As a consultant, name your price." I had been expecting this call, or one like it. I had my terms ready. "I'm willing to help," I said, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, I want a consulting contract at 5 times my former salary, paid monthly in advance, with a minimum 6-month commitment." He didn't even hesitate. "Done." "Second, I retain intellectual property rights to any code I write to fix this situation." "That's not standard." "Neither is losing millions because someone decided to replace working code with untested alternatives," I interrupted. "Those are my terms. I retain IP rights, with NetGlide receiving a perpetual license to use the code." A long pause. "All right, what else?" "Complete authority over the resolution process. No interference from management. I determine what needs to be fixed and how. We can agree to that for the currency normalization system specifically." "And finally," I said, "Preston Langford has no involvement in this process. He doesn't attend meetings, review code, or provide input of any kind related to my work." The longest silence yet. "That's complicated. He's still EVP of Technical Operations." "Then uncomplicate it," I said firmly. "Those are my terms. Richard, take them or leave them." Another heavy sigh. "I'll make it happen. How soon can you start?" "I'll be there tomorrow morning. Have legal send the contract to my email tonight. I won't write a line of code until it's signed." "Thank you. Camille?" "Truly." I ended the call and poured myself another glass of wine. I wasn't celebrating exactly, but I did allow myself a moment of satisfaction. Not because NetGlide was suffering, I had spent too many years building that company to take pleasure in its pain. But because sometimes, the universe delivers lessons that need to be learned. The next morning, I arrived at NetGlide's offices with the signed contract in my bag. The atmosphere was dramatically different from when I'd left. Gone was the sleek confidence of a successful tech company. In its place was the frantic energy of crisis management. People hurried through the halls with worried expressions. Multiple conference rooms were filled with engineers staring intensely at screens covered in code. Richard met me in the lobby, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Thank you for coming," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "We've set up a workspace for you. The team is standing by to assist however you need." "I'll need access to the repositories first," I said. "Full access, including commit history for the past 2 months. Already arranged. Alice from IT has your credentials." He led me to a small conference room that had been converted into a temporary office. A workstation was set up with dual monitors and a new laptop. On the whiteboard, someone had written, "Currency Normalization Fix," in large red letters. A group of engineers waited nervously by the table. I recognized a few faces from before I left, but most were new Preston's hires, presumably. "This is the team that's been working on the issue," Richard explained. "They'll be at your disposal." I nodded and set down my bag. "I'd like to start by reviewing what changes were made to the original system." A young woman stepped forward. "I'm Zoe. I led the refactoring of the currency module. We have documentation of all the changes we implemented." "Show me," I said. Sitting down at the computer, for the next 3 hours, I reviewed code changes, commit messages, and architecture diagrams. It was exactly as I had expected. They had dismantled my spaghetti code and replaced it with clean modular microservices that failed to account for the complex edge cases the original system had handled. The main issues seemed to be with decimal placement in cross-currency transactions, Zoe explained. We've tried implementing several fixes, but each one seems to create new problems elsewhere. I nodded, continuing to scroll through code. That's because you're treating symptoms, not causes. The original system wasn't just normalizing decimal places, it was handling regulatory requirements, banking system idiosyncrasies, and historical compromises that evolved over years. The room was silent as I continued to review the changes. Finally, I closed the laptop and looked up at the anxious faces around me. I could fix this code immediately, I said, but that wouldn't address the real problem. Richard frowned. What do you mean, the real problem is that our billing system is broken? Clients are leaving. We need it fixed now. The real problem, I countered, is that decisions were made without understanding the consequences. If I just provide a quick fix, the same thing will happen again with some other system. I stood and walked to the whiteboard, erasing the currency normalization fix header and writing understanding the system instead. Before I write a single line of code, we're going to go through exactly what the original system did, why it was designed that way, and what the consequences of changing it were. This is a learning opportunity. Richard looked like he wanted to object, but remembered our agreement. How long will this take? A few hours to explain, a day or two to implement proper fixes, longer to rebuild client trust. But that's not my department. He nodded reluctantly. I'll leave you to it. Then, for the rest of the day, I conducted what amounted to a masterclass in financial systems integration. I explained every aspect of the currency normalization engine, why certain compromises had been made, what regulatory requirements influenced the design, how banking systems in different countries handled transactions differently. The engineers took furious notes. Many looked horrified as they realized the complexity their clean refactoring had failed to account for. Others asked insightful questions that showed they were beginning to grasp the true nature of the problem. By late afternoon, I finally opened a text editor and began to write. This, I said as I typed, is the core normalization function. It looks complex because it is complex. It handles 17 different currency formats with varying decimal conventions, banking system requirements, and regulatory frameworks. Line by line, I rebuilt the function that Preston had deemed bad code. I added extensive comments explaining each condition, each edge case, each seemingly odd decision. As I worked, I could see understanding dawning on the faces around me. By evening, I had implemented a basic version of the original normalization bridge. I pushed the changes to a staging environment. Run some test transactions through this, I instructed. Start with the most problematic cases you've encountered. While they tested, I stepped out to get some air. In the hallway, I encountered a familiar face, Jana from accounting, who had been at NetGlide almost as long as I had. Camille, she said, embracing me warmly. Thank God you're back. This place has been a nightmare. The finance department is drowning in manual corrections and customer complaints. I'm not back, I clarified. Just consulting to fix the currency system. She lowered her voice. Is it true? Did Preston really scrap your system without understanding it? I shrugged. Decisions were made. Now we're dealing with the consequences. Well, Harrison is furious. I've never seen him so angry. There was a board meeting yesterday that apparently ended with him shouting at Preston in front of everyone. I felt no satisfaction at this news. Family dynamics at the workplace were always messy and rarely productive. How bad is the financial impact? I asked. Jana grimaced. Bad. We've lost 7 enterprise clients completely. Dozens more have suspended services until this is resolved. The quarterly projections are concerning. I nodded. We should have a working fix by tomorrow. That fast? She looked surprised. The solution isn't complicated once you understand the problem, I said. The challenge was always in understanding the problem. When I returned to the conference room, the energy had shifted entirely. The engineers were animated, excited. It's working, Zoe exclaimed. We ran 50 test cases through the staging environment, All processed correctly. I nodded. Good, but that was just the basic function. We still need to implement the full solution, with proper handling for all the edge cases. We worked late into the night, rebuilding the currency normalization system piece by piece. I explained each component as we went, ensuring that this time, the knowledge wouldn't be lost when I left. Around midnight, Richard appeared with food delivery bags. "I figured you could use dinner," he said. "How's it going?" "Progress," I replied. "We should have a complete solution ready for testing by morning." He looked relieved. "That's faster than I expected. The team said it might take weeks to understand what was wrong, let alone fix it." "It helps when you built the original system," I said. "And when you're not trying to reinvent it for the sake of architectural purity." He winced slightly at the implied criticism, but didn't argue. The next morning, after a few hours of sleep on an office couch, we completed the implementation and pushed it to staging for final testing. By noon, all test cases were passing successfully. "I think we're ready to deploy," I announced. Richard had been hovering nearby all morning. "Are you sure we can't afford another failure?" "I'm sure," I said, "but I recommend a phased rollout. Start with a small percentage of transactions, monitor closely, then gradually increase." He nodded. "That sounds prudent. I'll coordinate with operations." Over the next 8 hours, we gradually deployed the fixed system to production. 5% of transactions at first, then 20, 50, and finally 100%. Each phase performed flawlessly. By evening, NetGlide's billing system was functioning correctly again for the first time in weeks. In the conference room that had been my temporary office, a small celebration broke out. Engineers who had been working around the clock for 2 weeks finally allowed themselves to relax. Someone ordered champagne. Richard made a brief speech thanking everyone for their efforts. I sat quietly, finishing my documentation and preparing to leave. This wasn't my victory. It was just the correction of an unnecessary mistake. As the celebration continued, the door opened, and Harrison Langford himself walked in. The room immediately fell silent. Harrison was in his 60s, silver-haired and imposing. He had built NetGlide from nothing into a company worth billions. He was respected, feared, and rarely seen on the engineering floors. "I understand we have a working solution," he said, looking around the room before his eyes settled on me. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "Full deployment completed an hour ago. All systems functioning normally." Harrison nodded. "Good. Very good." He turned to me. "Ms. Dawson, a word in private, please." I followed him to a small meeting room nearby. He closed the door and gestured for me to sit. "Richard has briefed me on the situation," he said, remaining standing. "I want to personally thank you for coming back to help resolve this crisis." "I was happy to help," I said neutrally. He studied me for a moment. "Richard also shared the terms of your consulting agreement, quite favorable terms. The situation called for specialized knowledge that only I possessed," I replied. "The market determines the value of rare commodities." A faint smile crossed his face. "Indeed it does." He sat down across from me. "I've reviewed the commit logs. It seems my son removed critical components of your system without understanding their purpose." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't violate the non-disparagement clause I had signed. "Preston has been reassigned," Harrison continued. "He'll be taking on a role in business development, away from technical operations." Again, I remained silent. "We'd like to discuss a more permanent arrangement," he said. "A senior technical role, with appropriate compensation and authority. The company clearly needs your expertise." I had anticipated this offer. NetGlide had dodged a bullet this time, but they knew there were likely other critical systems that only I fully understood. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but I'm not interested in returning as an employee. I'm happy to continue consulting on specific issues as they arise." Harrison frowned. "You built much of our core technology. You clearly care about its integrity. Why wouldn't you want to return to ensure it's properly maintained?" "Because the problem wasn't technical," I said. "It was cultural. A culture that values superficial modernization over functional stability, that dismisses expertise because it doesn't conform to current trends, that allows decisions to be made based on personal connections rather than merit. He stiffened slightly. That's a rather harsh assessment. It's an honest one, I replied. And until that culture changes, the same problems will recur, just in different forms. Harrison was silent for a long moment. He was not a man accustomed to such direct criticism. What would you suggest, then? He finally asked. Implement proper knowledge transfer protocols. Document institutional knowledge before replacing systems. Create paths for experienced engineers to advance without becoming managers. Value maintenance as highly as innovation. And most importantly, create a culture where questioning decisions based on expertise is encouraged, not punished. He nodded slowly. Those are reasonable suggestions. Would you be willing to help us implement them as a consultant, with terms similar to your current arrangement? I considered the offer. There was an opportunity here not just to make money, but to potentially transform how NetGlide operated, to create a culture that valued the invisible work of maintaining critical systems. I would consider a consulting role focused on knowledge management and cultural transformation, I said, with clearly defined goals and metrics for success. Draw up a proposal, Harrison said, standing. I'll make sure it gets proper consideration. As he turned to leave, I spoke once more. One more condition. He paused, looking back. In the future, when someone tells you a piece of code looks messy but works perfectly, ask why it was written that way before replacing it. Harrison's expression was unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded. A lesson expensively learned. Ms. Dawson, I assure you, it won't be forgotten. After he left, I finished my documentation, adding one final comment at the end of the main function. Next time, ask questions. I pushed the final commit and closed my laptop. Tomorrow, I would begin drafting a proposal for a new kind of consulting arrangement, one focused on preserving the knowledge that kept companies like NetGlide running, the invisible pillars supporting their success. As I gathered my things to leave, Zoe approached me. I just wanted to say, I learned more in these 2 days than in my entire time at NetGlide, she said. The way you explained the system, why each piece matters, it was like seeing beneath the surface for the first time. I smiled. Systems are like icebergs. Most people only see the clean interfaces above the water, but the real complexity, the critical functionality, is hidden below. I wish I'd worked with you before all this happened, she said. Well, you'll be working with me again, I replied. I'll be consulting on knowledge management going forward, and I'll need allies who understand why it matters. Her face brightened. Really, I'd like that? Good. First lesson when someone dismisses code as spaghetti without understanding its purpose. That's not expertise, it's arrogance. She nodded earnestly. I won't forget. As I walked out of NetGlide that evening, I felt a sense of closure. I hadn't sought revenge when Preston dismissed my work and pushed me out. I hadn't needed to. The systems I had built were complex, because the problems they solved were complex. Removing that complexity without understanding it had led to inevitable failure. But from that failure came an opportunity not just for me, with my lucrative consulting contract, but for NetGlide itself. An opportunity to recognize that innovation isn't just about new features and clean architecture. It's also about respecting the institutional knowledge that keeps everything running smoothly. Sometimes, the most valuable code is the code that looks messy but works perfectly. And sometimes, the most valuable people in a company are the ones who understand why that messiness exists. I drove home in the fading light, already planning my proposal. This wasn't about getting even or proving a point anymore. It was about building something better, a culture that valued the invisible pillars holding everything up. And if that culture happened to make me wealthy in the process, well, that was just the market determining the value of rare commodities.